Welcome back, my delectable darlings of the dark. Tonight, I have a story for you. It begins with a simple wish, a yearning for control, and a set of hands that could give you everything, or take it all away. There once was a woman named Margot Santini, a restorer of antiques. Fragile, delicate works of time passed through her deft hands and became born-again treasures. To her, these objects weren't simply artifacts, they were whispers from the past, each with a soul of its own. But Margot herself felt hollow, tethered to a life of routine. Her talent could scarcely pay the bills. Her relationships had grown brittle like sun-bleached porcelain. That all changed one gloomy autumn when she attended an estate auction filled with relics so peculiar they almost seemed alive. Among heaps of decaying furniture and tarnished silverware, she found them, a pair of exquisitely carved wooden hands. They were larger than life, eerily lifelike, with veins and tendons chiseled so precisely it appeared they were flexing. But no, they were still. At the base of each hand, the wooden stumps splintered outward like crude marionette controls. The auctioneer muttered something about an unknown origin and a troubled history. "These belong to Vittorio Castellani," he whispered, his voice dropping to a hush. "The puppet master who made kings and queens dance before vanishing without a trace." Strange, Margot thought, but intriguing. She bid on them, and she won. At home, with her cat Nero watching from his perch, she set the hands on her workbench. The instant her fingers grazed the knotted wood, a shiver exhaled deep from within her marrow. Were the hands cold, or was it her imagination? They seemed to pulse faintly under her touch, as though imbued with an uncanny vitality. That night, she could have sworn she heard them scraping against the wood of her workbench, trying to flex their wooden joints. In the nights that followed, Margot began changing, ever so slightly. Small things. Her tired sighs after a long day softened into hums of strange satisfaction. Mundane chores no longer felt arduous. Instead, she'd find completed tasks that she swore hadn't been her doing at all. Dishes washed, clothes folded, books rearranged by author rather than her usual sorting by color. Must be exhaustion, she rationalized. But then came the dreams. Oh, those dreams. Vivid and visceral. She saw herself standing on her balcony, the world beneath her bending to her will. Trees uprooted from the ground, rivers reversed their flow. Friends and strangers alike obeyed her gestures as if bewitched. In the dream, she raised her hands to the sky, commanding lightning with the bare twist of her dainty wrists. But as she looked down at her arms, she realized they weren't hers anymore. They were made of polished wood, carved with the same exquisite detail as the hands on her workbench. These were not ordinary hands. A week later, she encountered her first real test. The unpleasant landlord, as wiry and wiry-haired as a rat, knocked on her door. He muttered about unpaid rent, laying threats to evict her. As Margot reached for her purse to defend herself, she felt a force buzzing through her arms. Without thinking, she whispered, "Stop," and raised her hand, palm outstretched. The landlord froze, literally like a human statue. His eyes bulged, but every other part of him remained suspended. Margot screamed, trembling. But the oddest part, not out of fear, but exhilaration. After a second, she flicked her wrist backward, and instantly he stumbled out of her apartment, panting as though he'd run a mile, no memory of what had just transpired. The seed was planted. What were these hands capable of? She practiced in secret. Small things at first, making her cat Nero perform tricks no feline should know, rearranging furniture without touching it, stopping raindrops mid-air during a storm. With each new act, her confidence grew, but so did a strange hunger within her. Power, once tasted, demands to be fed. The next morning, Margot found something disturbing. The wooden hands were not where she left them. Instead, they were positioned differently on her workbench, fingers splayed wide, as if reaching for something. Or someone. A chill ran down her spine as she noticed tiny scratches on the wooden surface, trailing from where she'd left them. That evening, she attended a gallery opening, wearing a flowing black dress that concealed the strange wooden texture now creeping up her forearms. Her newfound confidence attracted admirers, including Marcus, a handsome curator she'd admired from afar. When he slighted her work in conversation with another guest, Margot felt that familiar buzz in her veins. With the subtlest flick of her wrist, Marcus's champagne flew into his face. Another twitch, and he was compelled to praise her work loudly, extravagantly, to everyone present. She smiled, drunk with control. But in the bathroom mirror, she caught a glimpse of her reflection. Her eyes had darkened to the color of ancient mahogany, and the veins in her neck resembled wood grain. That night, she dreamed she was on a vast stage, surrounded by marionettes dancing to her commands. As she looked closer, she recognized faces: her landlord, Marcus, her estranged sister, former lovers, all with strings attached to their limbs, their movements jerky and unnatural. Behind her stood a tall, shadowy figure, its hands reaching over hers, guiding them. "What a quick study you are," it whispered, its voice like sawdust in the wind. Margot woke with a start, drenched in cold sweat. Nero was nowhere to be found, though she could hear plaintive meowing from somewhere inside the walls. Stumbling to her workbench, she found the wooden hands had moved again. This time, they were positioned as if applauding. A note lay between them, written in a script that looked eerily like her own handwriting, though she had no memory of writing it. "The puppet master's hands demand payment. 1 soul for each finger, and then your own." Horrified, she tried to get rid of the hands. She threw them in the trash, but they reappeared on her bed. She tried burning them, but the flames turned black and died. She tried burying them in the garden, only to find them nestled beside her when she woke. And each morning, her own hands looked more like wood, rigid, jointed, with splinters forming where her fingernails should be. People began to disappear from Margot's life. First, her building's superintendent vanished after she'd made him fix her leaking pipes in the middle of the night. Then a competing antique restorer who'd stolen a client. Then Marcus, last seen entering Margot's apartment for a nightcap. With each disappearance, the wooden texture crept further up her arms, past her elbows, toward her shoulders. Desperate, Margot sought help from an elderly woman who owned an occult bookshop. The moment the woman saw her increasingly wooden arms, she recoiled in horror. "Castellani's hands," she whispered. "They say he made a deal with something ancient to manipulate reality itself, but the power consumed him, turned him into a vessel, a conduit for something hungry. Do you hear it yet? The whispering? The instructions?" Margot wanted to deny it, but she couldn't. The voices had started 3 days ago, telling her who deserved punishment, who needed to be controlled, who would make a lovely puppet. She'd been following their commands without question. "You must find all those you've taken," the old woman instructed. "They're not gone. They're trapped, their souls feeding the hands, their bodies becoming new vessels. Find them before the transformation is complete." That night, Margot returned to her apartment determined to end this nightmare. The wooden texture had reached her neck now, and she found breathing increasingly difficult. Following a strange compulsion, she pressed her palms against the wall of her workroom, and the wall dissolved. Behind it lay an impossible space, a vast workshop filled with life-sized marionettes hanging from the ceiling. As she stepped closer, she recognized them: the landlord, Marcus, all the others, their bodies transformed partially into wood, faces frozen in silent screams. Above them all hung a larger puppet, its wooden body that of a man in antiquated clothing, a placard naming him Vittorio Castellani. As Margot stared in horror, she felt her joints stiffening, her skin hardening completely into wood. The puppets began to move, turning their heads in unison to stare at her. And behind them all, emerging from shadows that shouldn't exist, came an enormous pair of hands, their surface black as night, fingers long and spindly, moving with terrible purpose. "The cycle continues," came a voice from nowhere and everywhere. "A new puppet master rises." In that moment, Margot understood with terrible clarity. She wasn't the controller. She was merely the next puppet in a long line, another vessel for something that had existed long before Castellani, something that fed on the desire for control. As the massive hands descended toward her, her own wooden hands rose of their own accord to meet them. The next day, a listing appeared for an estate auction. Among the advertised items, a collection of exquisitely detailed wooden puppets and a pair of beautifully carved hands, perfect for a collector or restorer with a discerning eye and a yearning for something more in life. And somewhere, a woman with kind eyes and a passion for antiques feels inexplicably drawn to the advertisement, already imagining how those hands would look displayed in her workshop. The Puppet Master's show must go on, my darlings. After all, there are always strings to pull, and someone must pull them. Sleep tight, and do be careful what you touch in the darkness. Some treasures are not meant to be possessed, for they possess you instead.